Hello, I'm Michael Wunsch. I'm the plant pathologist at the North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. This is the third video in a series of 4 videos in which I am discussing the integrated management of Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot in field peas. This video will focus on the impact of crop rotation. This is the abbreviated version of this video, which I just present major conclusions without detailed explanations. The research was funded by the Northern Pulse Growers Association in conjunction with the North Dakota Department of Agriculture's Pesticide Harmonization and Registration Board and the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture. This research was only possible with the funding from these sources. We conducted 2 sets of research studies evaluating the impact of crop rotation interval. The first of these are long-term crop rotation studies that we're conducting in Hettinger, North Dakota, and Carrington, North Dakota. In those long-term studies, what we have learned is that the longer the crop rotation interval between peas, the lower the root rot pressure. What we have also learned, however, is that extended crop rotation interval only reduces your Aphanomyces fusarium root rot. It does not eliminate it. And in order to achieve satisfactory management of this root rot complex, you need to combine extended crop rotation interval with other tools. I'd like to begin by discussing results from the Hettinger location. Now, we established this study on ground that had no prior history of pea or lentil production. The purpose of this study was to evaluate how crop rotation interval impacted the buildup of root rot. What you can see immediately by looking at these data is that we saw the best response to crop rotation interval when we moved to a 6-year crop rotation. It was the 6-year crop rotation that has, to this point in the study, facilitated a reduction in the buildup of root rot. The 4-year rotation has not facilitated a reduction in the buildup of root rot. We conducted the study in Carrington on a field that had a long history of pea and lentil production and had an established problem with Aphanomyces and Fusarium root rot. What you can see from the data presented here is that we only achieved commercially acceptable yields with field peas with a 6-year rotation. The 4-year rotation certainly helped versus a 2-year rotation, but the yields were marginal. Now, we conducted the testing in Carrington with and without a fungicide seed treatment. What you'll notice here is that we consistently got a 5 bushel or more response to fungicide seed treatment, irrespective of the crop rotation interval. Now, I discussed the response to fungicide seed treatment in greater detail, but this emphasizes my point that I made earlier. Crop rotation interval is one of the tools that we can utilize to help manage this root rot complex, but we need to utilize other tools in conjunction with it. The other thing I would point out is that if you look at that 2-year crop rotation, and you look at the root rot severity across the years, you'll notice it jumps around tremendously. Now, we assessed root rot at a consistent growth stage all those years. It was always early mid-vegetative growth. But why the big differences in root rot severity? Well, the reason is because we planted at different times, at different soil temperatures. And when we had the lowest root rot severity at that early mid-vegetative growth, those were the years where we planted early, when the soil temperatures were cool. Now, I have a different video that explains in great detail the response to planting date. But what this emphasizes is that those high yields that we achieved in 2020 with that 6-year rotation, well, those were due to a combination of 3 things. First off, the long crop rotation. Second, early planting. And third, well, the yields presented in this graph would be the average between seed treatment and no seed treatment. And so seed treatment also helped us. Now, we conducted a second set of studies looking at the impact of crop rotation interval. And these were studies, planting date studies, that we conducted in 2023 and 2024 in Carrington across 11 fields that all had a long history of pea and lentil production, but differed in the interval since the last time peas or lentils were grown. These also differed in the severity of the Aphanomyces root rot. And what we learned from these studies was that the longer the crop rotation interval between peas, the lower the root rot pressure, just like we saw in our long-term crop rotation studies. And we also learned the exact same thing we saw in the other study, that crop rotation is one of multiple tools that helps with root rot management. We can't rely on crop rotation alone. but crop rotation certainly helps us, and it gives us more flexibility in terms of the execution of our other tools. So let's look at the results from 2024. In 2024, we had good spring conditions that allowed early planting, and we had a full range of planting dates. And what you can see is that here are bar graphs showing average results across all the fields with a tight crop rotation interval, an intermediate crop rotation interval, and a long crop rotation interval. And what you can see immediately with the root rot severity data is that the longer the crop rotation interval, the less the root rot. And we achieve very low levels of root rot with early planting and a long crop rotation interval. You see the same relationship with the wilt data. These are the percent of plants that were wilted at mid to late pod fill. And you can see that the longer the crop rotation interval, the lower the wilt. And finally, the yield data. What you can see here is that at least in planting dates 2 to 4, as your crop rotation interval increased, your yields increased. There was a difference, though, in planting date number 1. When we got in very early, we were able to maintain very high yields, even with a tight crop rotation. We conducted the same set of studies in 2023. Planting date studies with 4 planting dates across 11 different fields in Carrington, differing in the interval since the last time peas were grown. In 2023, unfortunately, very cold, wet conditions precluded us from planting very early. Our first planting date was very late, May 22nd to 23rd. So there's no early planting in these studies. But we still got 4 planting dates in. What you can notice in the data, from the root rot data, is that we see the same relationship with crop rotation interval and root rot severity. The longer the crop rotation interval, the lower the root rot severity. Likewise with the wilt data. The longer the crop rotation interval, the lower the incidence of wilt. Finally, with our yield data. The longer the crop rotation interval, the higher the average yields. Now, I want to go back to that study conducted in 2024 when we were able to do early planting. In those studies, we evaluated a tolerant variety, AAC Julius, versus a more susceptible variety, AAC Prophet. And again, across those 4 planting dates. And what we learned in those studies is that extended crop rotation interval gives us greater flexibility in both planting date and variety selection. And if we need to plant on a tight or crop rotation interval, we need to pay very close attention to our planting date and our variety selection. Let's look at that in detail. All right, what you see here would be the percent of wilted plants in the studies conducted with a tight crop rotation interval versus a very long crop rotation interval. This is the analysis across 4 different studies with a long crop rotation interval and 5 different studies with a tight crop rotation interval. Every circle shows the response in one study. AAC Julius is a field pea variety with moderate tolerance to Aphanomyces. AAC Prophet is a field pea variety with susceptibility to Aphanomyces. What you can see immediately is if you had a tight crop rotation interval, the only way you could end up with an acceptable level of wilt at the end of the season, i.e. less than 10% incidence, was by planting the tolerant variety. If you planted the susceptible variety, you had very high levels of wilt. And also, with that tight crop rotation interval, there was a tremendous penalty to planting late. Let's look at that long crop rotation interval. What you see there is that with the tolerant variety and the susceptible variety at early planting, you had incidence of wilt less than 10%. And if you couldn't plant early and had to delay, you had more flexibility, and you still had less than 10% incidence with the tolerant variety planting about 2 weeks later. So what does this say? It says that if you need to plant on a tight crop rotation interval and you know you have Aphanomyces pressure, you need to make sure that you're very cognizant of your variety selection, making sure you get a tolerant variety planted, and you need to be very careful about your soil temperatures at planting. Make sure you plant at that target 43 to 50 degree Fahrenheit soil temperature at the 2-inch seeding depth in the first 7 days after planting. Let's look at the comparison for, again, these wilt data between the 3 to 4 year rotation and the 5 to 6 year rotation. What you'll see right here immediately is the exact same relationship, where you had greater flexibility on planting date and variety selection if you had a longer crop rotation interval. So let's look at the yield data. Here we are comparing those studies with a tight crop rotation interval versus a very long crop rotation interval. What you can see immediately is that there is an enormous penalty to planting the susceptible variety when your crop rotation interval was tight. When your crop rotation interval was long, yes, there was a penalty to planting this susceptible variety, but the penalty was much lower. i.e., if you are planting on a tight crop rotation interval, you need to be very careful about your variety selection. The same goes with the planting date. The penalty to planting 2.5 weeks later was much greater when you were on a tight crop rotation interval than when you were on a longer crop rotation interval. The same relationship holds again when we look at the data for a 3 to 4 year rotation versus a 5 to 6 year rotation. Again, when you have that tighter crop rotation interval, it becomes imperative to be very careful about variety selection and your planting date. So what have we learned? We have learned that crop rotation interval helps with the Phantomyces cerevisiae root rot management. Specifically, as you have a longer crop rotation interval, it gives you greater flexibility on your variety selection and a little bit more flexibility with your planting date. But crop rotation interval should never be utilized alone. It should be always combined with other tools that also help with the management of this disease complex. Thank you again to the granting agencies that provided funding for this research, and thank you for your time.